where I talked about the sort of the differences between startups and big companies and the advantages that the big companies really have when it comes to innovation, right? Because if you were an outsider, you would think that large companies are sort of these big nincompoops who really can't get out of their own way and never get innovation to market. And while I think that perception is just that, it's a perception. I mean, quite frankly, if you think about the starting point of a large company, you've got all the customers and you've got the money. What else do you want to start from, right? If you can't take advantage of money and customers and leverage both, then you're definitely doing something wrong. I work for a large company, one that is, thankfully, has a few customers and a few dollars. And we do innovation probably a little differently than most. There's a couple little quotes here from our CEOs as I go through this. They're just really sort of intended to get you to think. And this session, I'm going to talk about our Intrapreneurship program, which I mentioned earlier I'm the founder of. And it was really intended to foster corporate entrepreneurship from everybody who works at IBM, not just the people who work in research and development or not just the people with innovation in their title. So this is in part about culture and employee engagement. So I'm going to start with a quiz for everyone in the room. So it might be a little hard to read, but which one of these was not invented or pioneered by IBM? Anybody shout them out if you think you know. Mars rover. Instant photography is the correct answer.
You want them on your team. Yeah.
So we do a lot of innovation. Sometimes it doesn't come out with our name on it. And sometimes it's world-changing. And it's a real, quite frankly, it's a real honor to be involved with a company that can do this kind of stuff. Now, a little bit about me before we get into this. And I thought that, I would use baseball as a metaphor to introduce myself. Until the first session, and I realized 3 of the 4 speakers weren't from the U.S. So I'm wondering if baseball was the right way to do this. But now Paul mentioned earlier he was going to talk about failing when he gets up after me, and that it was okay to fail. Paul, are you in the room? And is it going to be okay if the Mets fail?
I don't care who fails because we know the world champions are the Red Sox.
Oh, well played. Well played. The New York guy, who would have known, right? But up here, of course, is that great business and baseball philosopher, Yogi Berra, who once said, of course, if you don't know where you're going, you may end up somewhere else. And I think that's a perfectly apropos sort of statement around innovation and often sometimes the way you see some of these projects going. Now, for me, I didn't actually play Major League Baseball, but I did play baseball. And I sort of talked a little bit about this earlier. 25 years as an entrepreneur, the last 10 as an entrepreneur at IBM. And I've been lucky enough to have some success both as an entrepreneur and certainly been involved with some great projects inside of IBM. We see innovation as part of our values at IBM, and I will show you those a little later on. And because of the size of what we do, we really do innovation as a continual thing. It's beyond a program. It's really something that's part of our culture. And just as a sort of an evidence, if you know any of the history of IBM, you know that we survived a near-death experience in the 90s because we may have lost our way a little bit during that time frame where politics and fiefdoms and bad decisions sort of ignored what was going on and outside of the walls of Armonk. We got into trouble, and thankfully we recovered from that when there was quite a bit of turnover. But it's what the IBMers call the near-death experience, and it's an aptly named, very scary time. But leading up to that, the computing industry is old, right? It started with tabulating machines and then programmable computers, and we're about to go into a new era that I'm going to talk a little bit about. But one of the major transformations that we had to make was transforming from a tabulating company to a true computing company. And this happened in the 1950s. And because there was a day when computers didn't have memory. And they weren't programmable, so you couldn't program to do certain things, right? Now, during this time period, they were counted. Has anybody ever seen one of these before? Right? Everybody at least know what these are. They're punch cards for the people under 30 in the room. And this was how your test exams and whatnot got counted, right? The old punch, it's kind of, it's sort of, the 2000 election in Florida with the punch card hanging Chad thing, right? But during this time, guess where most of our money came from? Off of the sales of punch cards. Right? It was a giant revenue stream for us. So when we as a company, we're transitioning to a new type of technology that everybody was excited about, programmable computers. Well, guess what it meant from a business perspective? It meant that we were going to have to cannibalize an incredibly profitable area of the business. And if you asked salespeople in the company, no one wanted to do this. We'll get along fine with punch cards, was sort of the message. But it was our CEO at the time, Thomas Watson Jr., who ultimately made the bet that making that difficult transformation would lead to greener pastures, and it did. Now, interestingly enough, if you work in, this is a very insightful and very astute quote, particularly the part in blue, success breeds its own failure. Right? Because in a large company, unlike a startup, it's really about the second act and the third act and the fourth act, and how you can continually have successful new innovation. Right? Startup is typically focused on the idea. And the techniques that you get the idea to market are very, very different than when you get to the point where you've already got 45 successful ideas and it's about the second act, third act, fourth act. There are historical examples of this. Anybody know who this is or what this is? Say again? I couldn't hear. No, it's not Bill Walton. He looks like Bill Walton, though. Good guess. He is not a basketball player.
It's the first electronic camera.
That is right. It is the first digital camera, electronic camera. The fellow's name is Steve Sasson. He is a person largely credited with this. He was an engineer at a company called Eastman Kodak, who used to be in the film business. And the film used to represent 90% of Kodak's revenue, and in 1975, they showcased this to the world and promptly sat on it, because they were afraid that it would cannibalize their film business. So you have to recognize these opportunities, and you have to make tough choices about sitting on technology. We made plenty of mistakes ourselves, but punch cards was not one of them, right? So here's an example of probably a transformation that needed to happen, because the story around Kodak is actually sad. So basic principles, in all of this, right? Technology is adopted by a set of behaviors or principles, because it's adopted by people, right? It's not adopted by a process or systems, right? People adopt technology. Everett Rogers first sort of codified this in Diffusion of Innovations in 1962. And then Geoffrey Moore later sort of took that idea and took it to the next level with Crossing the Chasm in the early 90s. What was the term that was used earlier? Yeah, you used the Valley of Death, right? So Valley of Death, similar concept. The point being is, once you get past early adoption, right, to go mainstream, it's a whole different set of challenges, and many ideas fail there, whether it's whatever label you want to put on it. Completely agree with this. We'll come back to that. Anybody want to guess what that is?
Morse code.
Morse code. Anybody know what it says? Close. Close. Fine ship, fine voyage. It was one of the last messages sent from the Titanic. And it was sent using state-of-the-art technology of that time, which was the telegraph. And there's the full Morse code alphabet. Now the telegraph, again, for the benefit of the millennials in the room who may not have heard of these things, was the original way that we did text messaging. And you typed in your dots and dashes, and it was incredibly error-prone, took a long time, was no fun. And what happened was, because these wires were in place, there was another fellow who came up with something that was pretty disruptive. Anybody know who that is? Close. Bell, Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone in 1876. And interestingly enough, Bell really didn't see himself in that time as a capitalist. He was an inventor. He wanted to, he was sort of on the Edison model. And, but he couldn't get people to license his telephone. At the time, the dominant player in what we would consider telecommunications today was Western Union. And Western Union owned all the wires, owned all the telegraph stations, employed all the telegraph operators who sent all these codes and messages for a fee, of course. But they just didn't see any value in this thing called the telephone. So you got to recognize these opportunities when they come up. Now, everybody says innovation is important and good. And 100% of the people, in fact, say it's either they very strongly agree, or somewhat agree that innovation is important to growth and competitive advantage. Yet, of that same group, 72% have confidence in their own organization's ability to do this. Right? If this is so important, why are we so bad at it? Right? It's a fundamental thing. So my view on this, and this is from a lot of study, both inside and IBM is out, is that ideas have their own life cycle, sort of building off of the Rogers and Chasm stuff, the Jeffrey Moore stuff, and that I sort of extended this model out to the left. And that there's a lot of stuff that happens before you really can get a lot of early adapters, right? And this is what I call the snail model, or the tortoise model, for obvious reasons. But, right, in a large company, there are at least 3 organizations who have to, can I get that back? We had a crash here. There are at least 3 organizations who have to touch an idea, right? The larger you are, the more acute this problem is, especially if you're a publicly traded company. Because the people who come up with the idea are not usually the people who commercialize the idea, who are not also the people who then take it to market and are responsible for the success or failure of it in the commercial marketplace. Gotta get down about 5. Go. Doesn't count on my time, Lewis. Keep going. All right, one more. So at least 3 different organizations have to touch these ideas, which, if you've worked in a large company, you know that, first off, this is the ugliest of all investment scenarios. So the financial guys hate organic innovation because you have to invest upstream before you ever see revenue, right? So all the financial guys see is risk, and there are so many things that can go wrong, and so few of these things ever get to the promised land of profitable, scalable, repeatable solution growth, that where do you think, in a publicly traded company, when it looks like we're going to have to tighten the belt for a quarter or two, you think the finance guys are going to cut the programs that have revenue committed to them, or are they going to cut these long-term things that may or may not ever pick, right? So it's death by 1,000 cuts. Least desirable situation. The other thing is, you really have these 3 different phases. It could be more in your company. Every time I draw this chart, I resist the temptation of trying to put labels on every single box, I think, because it's different in different companies, right? How the money is achieved and so forth. But there's at least 3 phases. And everything from politics to misalignment of incentives. I've seen the most innovative things come to market only to have the sales force reject it because the incentive system wasn't aligned with quotas. So navigating transition 1 and transition 2, there may be other transitions, are really critical success factors. I would argue the most critical success factors to ensure the continuity of those ideas. So the teams that are behind the idea, this gets into fundamental questions like, the teams behind the idea, do they stay with the idea and oversee it as it goes through these programs and organizations? Do you put it in a separate incubator and hope that you can re-inject it back into the organization? Right? How you get across these transitions is what must be achieved. The way you get across them, I think, is organizational, depends on the organizational dynamics. Now for us, we have to do what Ginny calls continual innovation. As I mentioned earlier, right, we believe that we're entering this new era of computing called the cognitive era. Tabulating systems, were just systems like punch cards that allowed us to count. This literally allowed organizations like the Social Security Administration to exist. Ability to count stuff. Programmable systems, right, which we have now really in many respects, hit the ceiling on in terms of capabilities, allowed us to do things like get to the moon and back. Right, pre-programming task and function and having a machine execute a set of instructions based on what we think we want it to do for us, either because we're solving some problem or we want to achieve something new. Right? So that's what programmable systems. Cognitive computing is about something completely different. Why can't I interact with computers the way I want to? Right? Why don't computers learn and do what I think they should do? And this is what cognitive is about. Right? As humans, this is how we think and learn. We observe, we interpret, we evaluate, we decide, and then we apply. Right? This is a human learning thing. This is not the way computers learn, right? But this is what the cognitive era will be about. We're investing, and we believe strongly that the relationship between people and computers is going to change, where systems are going to enhance and enable us to do things that have not been previously possible in a scalable, repeatable, accelerated kind of fashion. Now, we do a lot of patents, and we have for a long time. 22 consecutive years. Last year was the first time any company ever topped 7,000. I don't know what we do with all these patents. I know that we don't turn 7,000 a year into new offerings. Right? Now, some of these get licensed, obviously, to some, and some of them we make decisions about not commercializing. But it's a lot. And that's just primarily from our research and development division. We have a whole company full of other IBMers who have ideas about how to do stuff. We have gotten recognition for some of these things like Innovation Jam and Nobel Prize winning kinds of innovation. But really, I saw an opportunity about a year and a half ago. I felt that the larger percentage of the employee population was not being served with a way to get help on its ideas. Right? If you're in research or in a development organization, you have lots of ways to get help on your ideas. Lots of funding, innovation programs. But for the IBMers that are really the rest of us, the people who are out in the field, the people who do some other function in the company, I felt there was a gap. So I started the Intrapreneurship program, which is a community of like-minded people. And our whole goal is to help IBMers who have an idea, who may not have access to funding or resources, to get that idea from point A to point B. We have a strong coaching and mentoring component to this. It's primarily based on a volunteer model where IBMers are helping IBMers based on their experience. And the whole goal, again, is to find new sources of revenue or new ways of improving things based on engaging the population. So I forget who mentioned it earlier, was talking about employee engagement. We believe strongly in this and leverage a volunteer model, and it's because of our culture that we think this works for us. That said, I will tell you it is not perfect. Volunteer models have holes, and there's a lot of people who have best intentions who say they want to help with something, and then sometimes it doesn't always happen. But that going in. I firmly believe that the volunteer model far outweighs any shortcomings associated with that. We have a community with lots of different capabilities. The most noteworthy thing is something we call 8-minute pitch. 8-minute pitch is our process for how any IBMer can bring their idea forward and pitch it to get help. That help might be funding, subject matter expertise, resources. It gets pitched to a panel of general managers who are very senior IBM execs who, quite frankly, are looking for the next big idea. So we bring the senior executives who usually don't get to meet with a lot of these folks who have ideas. We bring them together in a pitch format. You get 8 minutes uninterrupted to pitch your ideas. And anything can happen from there. We've had ideas funded on the spot. We've had ideas, all kinds of, we're having a great deal of success with this. So as I close out here, I hope that I've been able to share sort of, our approach to innovation, continual innovation. We believe that this model, particularly as we enter this next wave of computing, will serve us well, because it's not just an IBM thing, it's all of our partners and customers who we embrace into this. So with that, I will stop here, and hopefully there's a question or two.